Oh, good morning, committee and guests. Welcome to our committee meeting this morning. Nice cold day out there. I did hear that Senator Peck might be having some car trouble, so he may be a little late. We'll acknowledge for that. I want to welcome everybody and start off with any bill introductions. Come on forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Representative Barb Wassinger. I represent the 111th district that comprises itself of Hayes, Victoria, and southern part of Ellis County. Today I am introducing 22 RS 2443. It's an act concerning water relating to the financing of public water supply projects, allowing financing for projects that are related to the diversion and transportation of water acquired through a water transfer, amending KSA 65-163D and repealing the existing section. If I'm here for any questions, and I'll stand for them now.
Any questions for the introduction? Seeing none, the way we do it in this committee is that you present it and we approve it by consent.
Yes.
Unless there's objections, then we'll have a vote. So
yes. Okay.
It's introduced by consent.
All right. I'm doing this on behalf of the City of Hayes and the City of Russell. So thank you very much, and I appreciate your consideration.
Thank you. Any other bill introductions today? Okay. Committee, we'll move on into the business. We'll begin with revisor's report on Senate Bill 346.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's nice to see you in person this year. Senate Bill 346 would amend several statutes that regulate milk and dairy products, including the standards for those products, the on-farm retail sale of milk, definitions, and fee sunsets. So beginning with the standards, currently the standards for what constitutes milk, goat milk, milk for manufacturing purposes, and grade A pasteurized milk are in the definition section of the dairy law, which you can see in section 3 of the bill. Senate Bill 346 actually removes those standards from the definitions and puts them in section 1, so they would be their own section of law if this bill were to pass. Next, I'll turn to the on-farm retail sale of milk or milk products. This should be fairly familiar to you, this issue. So section 2 of the bill addresses this. Current law defines on-farm retail sale of milk or milk products to mean milk or milk products sold to the consumer by a producer on the producer's farm from the production of the producer's dairy herd, so long as the person making the sale does not promote the sale of milk or milk products in any manner other than by a sign on the dairy farm. This limitation was found to violate the Constitution of the United States in a lawsuit filed in 2019. So Senate Bill 346 would address that unconstitutionality, and it would amend the definition for on-farm retail sale of milk or milk products by striking that unconstitutional limitation. And then additionally, new section 2 would allow the retail sale of milk and milk products if the containers of those products bears a label with a visible statement that is as follows: this product contains raw milk that is not pasteurized and could contain bacteria that may cause foodborne illness. Section 2 would also allow any person who does engage in the on-farm retail sale of milk or milk products to advertise those products so long as the advertisement is not false or misleading and states that the products are raw and unpasteurized, and violations of this section could result in a civil penalty. So now moving on to the definitions. Senate Bill 346 in section 3 would update the definitions for the dairy law. There are no new definitions that would be added, and most of the stricken language is addressed in other sections of the bill, like I just mentioned, with those standards and the on-farm retail sale of milk. Additionally, it does also amend the definition of imminent health hazard. It does strike that, but those requirements are moved to section 6 of the bill. And section 3 also does include a lot of technical cleanup and terminology and grammar. And finally, the bill does address fee sunsets. So section 4 and section 5 would extend the current sunset date on various milk and dairy fees that are set to expire in 2023, and it would extend that to 2028. And those include certain license fees for people who engage in certain milk and dairy businesses, as well as certain milk inspection and regulatory services. And then I will note that in Section 5, subsection C, which is on page 8, starting in line 19, a couple of changes were inadvertently dropped from one of the original drafts to what was printed. So that includes reducing the fee in line 19 from 0.01, that would be 0.0075. And then in line 22, after the term grade A milk products, we would add or other dairy products. Those two things were inadvertently dropped. And then additionally, on page 11, in line 9, there is a reference to a statute number that doesn't exist. So where you can see KSA 65784A, that should say section 1. And I would ask that if the committee does work the bill, that you consider making those corrections. The effective date of the bill would be publication in the statute book, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions for Tamara, Advisor? Seeing none, thank you very much. We'll now begin with testimony on the bill, and we'll start with the proponents, and we'll begin with Mr. Titus from the Department of Agriculture. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Kenny Titus. I serve as Chief Counsel for the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and I'm here to testify in support of Senate Bill 346 this morning. Tamara did an excellent job, as usual, summarizing what this bill attempts to do. Just to briefly echo some of what she said, there are really three major things that are happening with this bill. One of those is to address the raw milk provisions that are unconstitutional and update that language. The second is a reorganization of the definitions section and moving some of those pieces around. And then the third piece deals with the inspection fees. I think the most important for us at this point, not to be overshadowed by some of the other topics, is the fee piece. We have our fees in this bill. They sunset in 2023. I just want to emphasize we're not asking for any increase in the fees. We're just asking for a 5-year extension so that the fees aren't reduced below a level that would support the program. The current fee level has been in place since 2010, and we're happy to continue to operate at that level. The additional amendments that, if you'll see in my testimony, you can see exactly the changes Tamara described that were inadvertently left out of the printed version of the bill. We're asking to tweak that grade A definition because the way the fee structure was originally set up in the dairy law, if you used grade A milk, created a grade A product, we'd collect an inspection fee. And then if you used a grade B milk to create a grade B product, we would collect a fee on that. Well, grade B milk is milk for manufacturing purposes, typically used for cheese or products like that. There are no grade B milk producers in Kansas anymore. As far as I know, there are no fees collected under that statute because everybody produces grade A milk, and grade A milk is what goes into these processing plants regardless of what they're making. But the way the laws are structured, there's a small loophole that if you happen to import grade A milk and make a product with that milk isn't subject to inspection fees. So that's why we're asking to add the or other dairy products to sort of close that loophole so there's not an incentive to import milk from outside Kansas. And by doing that, we think it will actually, in the future, allow for a lowering of all processor fees. As I'm sure you're aware, there's been a large dairy plant announced out at Dodge City, and they have access currently to a number of dairies in Texas and Oklahoma. But if they get up to full production as they've projected and we're collecting fees on all the milk they produce, that's actually going to allow us to lower fees for all producers in the state because of the volume without harming the program. So we think that's a good change. It doesn't actually raise the intended fees on anybody as well. As to the reorganization, there was some language that caught folks' attention that got moved around. I would just emphasize that if you go back and look at the current definitions, some of that was probably originally based on how the federal rules were set up to mimic that, but it's called the definition section, but you'll notice, especially with the raw milk even, there's a definition, and then there's regulatory language that's sort of lumped onto the definition. And what our goal was to pull out those regulatory actions, put them in a separate section, so you're not citing the definition for the regulatory action you're taking. So it's currently there, but the majority of that, we just move things around into a new statute, a little bit into the raw milk, the standards of identity. And then I point out in my testimony specifically the imminent health hazard language. We move that into the statute that deals with emergency cease and desist orders if there's any problem at a production facility. And we think actually moving that language there puts it where it makes much more sense. It's not on an island. It's now tied to a statute that invokes the Administrative Procedure Act, especially emergency orders thereunder. So the steps the department needs to take are clear, the appeal rights are clearer, and it's all tied together. And this is something that's rarely used. I would also emphasize it's not a statute that would come into play, or at least the imminent health hazard part wouldn't come into play, or it's extraordinarily unlikely it would come into play on any raw milk producers. This is something that our inspectors would be looking at if they're on-site inspecting a facility. And since raw milk producers are not licensed or inspected, the odds of that ever becoming an issue with raw milk producers is almost zero. And then finally, for the raw milk changes, this language is very similar, not exactly like a language that was passed out in 2020. It's also similar to a bill we introduced in the House last year, so it's floated around a little bit. But because of that lawsuit, we've just pulled out the regulatory pieces of the on-farm retail sale definition, put it in a new statute. We believe the new minimum requirements on advertising and labeling make sense as advertising has been broadened and more folks will have access to this product. And we think it also makes sense to have the department in charge of making sure those rules are followed rather than relying solely on a prosecution by a county attorney or the attorney general. So I would be happy to stand for any questions.
All right, thank you. Any questions for? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next, we have Aaron Papelk from Kansas Livestock Association. Welcome to the committee, Aaron.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pleasure to be here this year. As he said, I'm Aaron Papelk with the Kansas Livestock Association. Most of you probably know us for our representation of the beef industry, but we do have a dairy council that produces a significant amount of the state's milk. And so I'm here today to talk about, primarily I'll spend most of my time on the raw milk label. Our dairy producers have looked at the other changes that Mr. Titus mentioned and are comfortable with those. It's important, I think, for our producers who are associated send most of their milk through milk processors, and their milk is subject to the pasteurization process, that we have a label that clearly indicates to consumers that what the product is and that there is a higher risk of foodborne illness. It's not a ban, it's not a prohibition. Our organization's pretty free market. We just want to make sure that folks are aware of the higher risk of the product. And I think this is especially important after the case that found that the prohibition on advertising was invalid, and so now we have widespread advertisement. We're reaching a bigger group of folks who may not be as informed on the risks that they know if they pick up a product that says right there on the label could contain bacteria that may cause foodborne illness. And for some of you, you're familiar with food regulation. That phrase comes right out of the USDA regs that you'll see on raw meat products in the stores. And I cite the CFR there. So pretty simple ask. I think for folks to do. It's in the meat industry, it's not proven to be a inhibition to sales. And just for your information, we include in there some information from CDC KDHE that backs up that while there may not be a huge risk, there is a risk. These cases do happen where there is foodborne illness. And the other thing I think important for the label for our folks is that when a potential outbreak happens, that we're able to make sure that we can identify, okay, is this raw milk, is it pasteurized, and figure out where that disease vector came from. The final thing I'll mention at the end of the testimony, our policy, our dairy producers feel strongly that if they're inspected at the grade A or AA level, that all producers should be inspected. Now, this bill doesn't have that in it, and it may not be the vehicle. If some of you feel like that is, great, we're happy to work with you. But if you think it's better for a different vehicle, we're happy to work with you on that too. I'm compelled to ask for that, given our members' policy. Again, we think this is a good bill and ask that you move it forward, and happy to stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Any questions for Aaron? Senator Reichman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm kind of new to committee, and I'm trying to figure all this stuff out. This was mentioned, but it wasn't quite clear. When we go to the, not the pasteurized, but the next, the lower level or whatever, is any of that actually sold to like regular consumers, or are they sold like, where does it go? And then secondly, when you mentioned the amount of illnesses and the outbreak, have we had any in the state of Kansas? Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer your first part first. Hopefully I understood it. I think it's where can pasteurized milk be sold and unpasteurized milk so that's in the first part of my testimony, and the department can correct me if I say this wrong, but unpasteurized raw milk can only be sold off farm. Pasteurized milk can be sold at wholesale retail. The second part of your question is on outbreaks in Kansas linked to raw milk. In the third paragraph from the bottom of my testimony, in the middle there is some of the known cases in Kansas linked to raw milk consumption.
Thank you. Any other questions, Aaron? Oh, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Here's a chance to talk about eggs. We let farmers sell eggs off farm without, if it's a particular amount, without those licensing, concerns. Do you have any concerns about that, or is it just the milk?
This may come as a shock to you. We don't represent egg producers, so I'm not going to weigh in on that. I will just reiterate the last part of our testimony, where our producers who are licensed inspected facilities believe that all milk producers should be at the same level. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next we'll call on John Donnelly from Kansas Farm Bureau. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am John Donnelly. I'm here today on behalf of Kansas Farm Bureau. I'm going to actually focus a little bit on the fee extension piece, and this would normally be written testimony, but I feel every 4 or 5 years we have this fee extension discussion, and every 4 or 5 years I come up and oppose them because there's always a fee increase. So I guess I'm here today to show our support for the extension of this sunset. I think the department and the program within the Department of Agriculture has done a good job. They do a good job, and our policy in general supports having state general fund these types of programs. So we show our appreciation for the fact that they are not looking to increase fees. In fact, they're looking long-term to decrease fees because this does have a general public health benefit. It's not just the dairy farmers that benefit, it's the general public that benefits from this regulation. So I'm here today mainly just to state that we support the fee extension in contrary to our positions over the years when they bring fee increases, and I have to oppose them. So that's really what I wanted to say. We generally support the other technical changes that are in this bill and commend all of the parties. I think the raw milk language is close. We've tried to avoid getting ourselves too inserted in that debate the last couple of years, but I think the parties on both sides have come to a fairly good agreement on what they can live with on that language. So I'll stand for questions.
All right. Thank you, John. Any questions for Mr. Donnelly? Thank you, John. That's the list on the list we have for proponents. Is there anyone else who would like to testify as a proponent this morning? Anyone else? Any more proponent testimony? If not, we'll move on to opponents, and we'll begin with Sam McRoberts. Welcome to the committee.
I'm Sam McRoberts. I'm an attorney at Kansas Justice Institute. We're a nonprofit pro bono litigation firm. And we were the ones who originally filed the raw milk lawsuit back in 2019. We represented Mark and Coraline Bunner in a lawsuit challenging this prohibition against off-farm advertising. And so this is just a little bit of background, which is going to lead up to my suggestion for this bill. So for maybe 50 or 60 years, raw milk producers could produce milk. They could sell milk from their farm, but they couldn't talk about raw milk away from their farm. The only thing that they could do is put up a sign on their property that basically says, come in and you can buy the milk here. Then for people like Mark and Coraline, it was very problematic. They lived at the end of a dirt road. No one was driving down past their house, and a sign on their property just didn't make any sense. And all they really wanted to do was build a website that says, come see our raw milk farm and come purchase raw milk from us. We filed the lawsuit, and the Attorney General agreed with our position that the prohibition against advertising was unconstitutional. Again, that was in 2019. Then that leads into Senate Bill 308, which was we all discussed Senate Bill 308. It talks about labeling, it talks about advertising, and I think that Senate Bill 308, as amended, contains the appropriate language for labeling. I put that in my testimony, and this is the part that I just want to clarify. If you look at Senate Bill 308 as amended and HB 2156, which was introduced but not heard last year, there is a difference between the labeling requirement contained in those two bills and the labeling requirement in SB 346. And Mr. Donnelly's correct. We're very, very close on coming up with agreed upon language for a labeling requirement. I do think it makes sense to say, to make sure that consumers know that the product is raw or unpasteurized. So therefore, there should be a label that suggests to the public that the milk is not grade A milk or that it is pasteurized. So under SB 346, there's one part of the language that I think just goes too far. And SB 308 as amended makes sense because the label should say the following or its equivalent: this product contains raw milk that is not pasteurized. That's all it needs to say. It doesn't need to contain anything else about may contain, or may cause foodborne illness. That's simply not needed under a label. I think what's also important, and I think it was Mr. Papelk that talked about this, there's a difference between raw milk producers who are selling a gallon or two of raw milk a month versus big grade A dairies. And so as I traveled around the state talking to raw milk producers, how they're labeling their bottles is, for the most part, writing on the bottle with a Sharpie pen or having the consumer come in with a bottle that says raw milk unpasteurized. So to add this additional language is in fact an administrative burden for people like Mark and Coraline Bunner who are handwriting these things on bottles. They don't have labeling machines. They don't have the type of administrative support to add these types of things to their bottles. And so we believe it makes sense to just stick with what SB 308 as amended said under the labeling requirement and HB 2156. And if that's what is eventually introduced or passed, I think we would be very supportive of that. And I think that based upon my conversations with raw milk producers, they could live with that language as well. In terms of the advertising, Mr. Titus, I think mentioned this. In our position is simply that if you look at SB 346 page 2, there should basically just be a period after any such advertisement shall not be false or misleading. Because again, the advertising may be off farm, but people still have to come to the farm to see the production. They still have the bottle with a label that says raw milk. So there's really no need to add anything other than shall not be false or misleading. And I'm happy to stand for questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. As far as you know, in Kansas, has there been any case of foodborne illness caused by unpasteurized milk?
Well, I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not an expert in the science. I would imagine that somebody probably has gotten sick at some point. And I think that there's no real argument or disagreement that maybe somebody has gotten sick, just like they've gotten sick from cheese, ice cream, other products. But the focus, in my opinion, shouldn't necessarily be on whether or not somebody is getting sick. That's a given in all areas of life. But the question is really the constitutional aspects with labeling and advertising. And so from our perspective, if you have a label that says this is raw or unpasteurized or the equivalent, that is sufficient to warn the person that the product is raw or unpasteurized. And I think it's also important to note that the people who are consuming or drinking raw milk understand what raw or unpasteurized milk is. You're not going to a grocery store and having 500 different bottles and it's hard to see what each product is. People are actually traveling to the location and they know what they're purchasing.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Next, we have by WebEx on the station up there, Mary Powell. Are you there?
Hello, can you hear me?
I didn't hear that yet. Go ahead.
Can you hear me okay there?
Getting better.
Okay.
A little more
I'll try to speak a little. I've got my volume up as high as possible.
There you go.
So.
You got it.
Okay. I'm Mary Powell. I'm from Longton, Kansas. I am a consumer of raw milk and raw milk products. You might remember me from the raw milk ban hearing that we had previously. I also brought my two little friends again, Moo Moo and Gabby, to remind us that we are dealing with two industries within the milk industry, the goat and the cow industry. I appreciate the time that you've given me this morning to testify. I too have an issue with the labeling. You have done a wondrous job of cutting back what the labeling was from the previous statement. I too agree with Sam that the product only needs to say this is raw milk or a raw milk product. The consumers, we're not stupid. We seek out raw milk producers because we know the inherent dangers of potential foodborne illnesses. But we also know that the benefits of consuming raw milk far outweigh the potential problems. Now, with any food, there are foodborne illnesses. The CDC, with the information that I gave you in the previous hearing that we had on raw milk, showed that the CDC reported more deaths from processed milk and milk products than from raw milk and raw milk products. So if we're going to have something as a label like that that could have bacteria that cause foodborne illnesses, we shouldn't only have it on the raw milk, but it should also be on the processed milk. Because there are just as many, if not more, hazards from processed milk when you go to look at all the handling in that. I too have an issue with the advertising. If we're going to, the consumers who go to these farms, we know the inherent dangers. We know what we're purchasing, or we wouldn't be going there. So, you know, when you deal with worried about inspections, you know, the consumer is the inspector. And most farms that I'm aware of in the state of Kansas that produces raw milk, they adhere to the grade A pasteurized milk ordinance. And this is a sanitary, it gives all the rules of how you're supposed to handle the milk. Every raw milk producer that I know in the state of Kansas, and I know quite a few, adhere to this. So they're just the same as an inspected USDA grade A dairy that sells to processors. I don't believe there's any higher risk of consuming raw milk than pasteurized milk, because I get sick drinking pasteurized milk. It causes terrible digestive problems when I can drink the raw milk and it doesn't cause a problem whatsoever. But now I would like to move on to page 1041, where they have where the secretary can declare a imminent health hazard. Now, while the gentleman who talked about this earlier, he stated that if there was a violation, he didn't see that there was a chance of a raw milk producer even having to face something like this. With today's government overreach, both at the state and federal levels, I feel that this could be a very dangerous piece of legislation if it is misinterpreted. And I really think it needs to be re-examined to have specific directions for the secretary, because the USDA and the state vet have the authority in such cases to shut down things if they see a violation. Now, granted, the dairy raw milk industry, they don't have that. However, the consumers will shut them down and report them if there is a problem. So the raw milk industry does realize a little bit of an advantage because the consumer can react immediately and they'll shut down. I'm not going to buy something from a dairy that causes me to get sick. And economics dictates on this too. So I think this section needs to be written to where it specifically states what situation would allow that secretary to take that step to declare harm or danger to the public health. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask.
All right. Thank you, Mary. Any questions for Ms. Powell? Seeing none, thank you very much for participation. Next, we'll turn our attention to Mr. Lloyd Bontrager from Hutchinson on WebEx. Lloyd, are you ready?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we got you loud and clear.
Good, good. Well, I'm Lloyd Bontrager, the owner of Bontrager Dairy in Hutchinson, Kansas. And I've been involved in the raw dairy industry all my life. I grew up on the farm I now manage, and raw milk has been a part of our life all my life. So the part I'm opposed about is the raw milk labeling, the additional labeling that was submitted about containing the bacteria that could cause foodborne illness. I don't think it's necessary to have this warning, just as it is not necessary to have a warning on pasteurized milk stating that it could cause allergic reactions, lactose intolerances, and dairy sensitivities. Those are three of the most important things that cause people to go to raw milk. And I did a web search, and you're welcome to do it too, on dairy sensitivities in the human population. And I was surprised, I'm guessing you will too. There's, on the world average, there's 68% of people have dairy sensitivities. And on our farm with our customers, that is very seldom the case because it's raw, grass-fed, and clean. And that's why I think there's no reason to have an additional label on this product if the pasteurized milk doesn't state anything that there's reactions that could be caused and making people suffer from indigestion and discomforts from that. So that's where I stand on it. I request to just leave it as raw or unpasteurized. And that would be my request, and that's all I have. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Bontrager. Any committee, any questions for Lloyd? Not seeing any. Thank you, Lloyd, for your testimony. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Committee, is there anyone else who wants to testify as an opponent here today? Seeing none, I will draw your attention to the opponent written only testimony in our packet. Those are written only. Has anybody else had any questions on what we've covered today? Committee? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had one question probably for the department, and that's, you know, I know that we're going to be looking probably in our discussion about the statement on the label, and I'm just wondering if we might want to also look at, it says this product contains raw milk, if we might want to also consider this product is raw milk or contains raw milk. And I would also talk with the revisor about that before we work this bill.
Anybody want to comment on that? Kenny? Oh.
I would just say there could be products other than milk, so it could be something that contains milk. To what extent is or contains, I don't know that we have a strong opinion.
I think I'm asking for both, so that it could also just, the raw milk doesn't have to contain raw milk. But I'll talk to the revisor about wording and see what might be appropriate.
That makes sense.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Seeing none, we will close the hearing on Senate Bill 346. And with that, we are adjourned.